Today we're going to be talking about Standard 3, the importance of communication in the Level 2 Adult Care Apprenticeship. We're just going to go straight through it. So, the first jobs you need to do are to be able to identify some barriers to communication and give some examples of ways to reduce those barriers. I've given you a few examples here. You can come up with a couple more by yourself or use these or something similar. So, first thing, if people have different languages, you would want to use a translator or an interpreter. You could use Google Translate as well, or you could try and learn some key phrases in that language as well. It wouldn't be great for trying to learn key phrases, or Google Translator isn't great for in-depth conversations that you'd need to have about care plans or future plans. The person needs to be able to understand fully and be able to give full responses, but on a day-to-day basis, it can help you. If somebody has a learning difficulty, they might use Makaton. Makaton is a very simplified version of British Sign Language. It's quite good. It usually has bigger gestures, simpler gestures than British Sign Language. So it can be quite good. Otherwise, speaking in short, clear sentences can be very helpful as well. If somebody has hearing loss, whether partial or full hearing loss, you might use technology, or they might use technology like hearing aids, or you might write things down. If somebody had a visual impairment, you would definitely use verbal communication. Again, whether it's partial or full visual impairment, you might lose some of the facial expressions, you might lose body language, so being very clear and having more animated voice might be very helpful in that situation. They might also use Braille instead of writing. And if someone is distressed, now distress or distraction can definitely be a barrier to communication. It can be very hard for people to think in those situations and concentrate on the conversation. So if it's distress, you would remain calm, definitely do your active listening, give people time to respond and to think about what they want to say. And I would not, in those situations, recommend telling somebody to calm down. When people are ready to calm down, they will calm down. Next up, we have describe ways to check that communication has been understood. Now, it does say describe, so we do have to give a little bit about how you would go about doing this. And it does say ways, so we do need multiple examples on this, minimum of 3. All right, so a few that I've given for examples for you could be looking for signs and signals that people have understood, like with body language and facial expressions, whether people are nodding their heads along with you or smiling or shrugging their shoulders. If they are frowning or have a slightly, maybe a blank, confused look on their faces, then you know that they maybe don't understand and you should try another method. Just asking people if they've understood, or trying to get people to rephrase or say it back to you so you know it's been understood as well. Or if you've demonstrated something to them, like you've demonstrated a new procedure, then you might get them to carry that procedure out, and that will show you that they have definitely understood it. Or to ask them to summarize the main points of the conversation, or you could summarize it. It's best if the person summarizes, just to make sure that they understand it. If they can summarize, you know they've understood it. Okay. Another question for you is to list sources of information, support, and services that enable more effective communication with individuals and others. It does say list, so you don't have to describe or explain. You can just write down a list or identify them. But you do have to make sure that you have all three sources of information, sources of support, and services included in your answer. So under some sources of information, I thought you could put down your manager, care plans, websites. Now, for websites, I would be specific and choose specific websites to give as examples. If you just put down websites, that could be anything. That could be a recipe website, so that's not great. One that you might want to start off with could be the Alzheimer's Society website, but there are plenty more for mental health, for visual impairment, hearing impairment that you could look up. Source of support, again, there's some crossover. You might talk to senior managers, you might talk to, you might talk to your manager, senior colleagues, other professionals, like doctors, psychologists, speech and language therapists. They might be able to provide you with support. Even family and friends of the person might be able to support you in that. They could, again, crossover. They could give you some information, or they might demonstrate the communication method that they have experienced that works best for that individual. And some services might be speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, interpreters, translators, British Sign Language interpreters, any of those. Or think of your own examples as well. All right, so we've got a list question again. You need to list some types of nonverbal communication. We have some examples there. Your normal writing, British Sign Language, Makaton, body language, I've got gestures there as well. So body language, like the way you're sitting. If you're sitting with your arms crossed, or you're sitting just loose and comfortable, it's a difference, and it does communicate. Maybe your feelings and how comfortable you are. Braille, if you're not familiar, is how people with, or some people, not everybody, some people with visual impairments can use Braille. It's where it's a series of raised dots on the paper that they can run their fingers across and read it in a way. All right. Give examples of situations where nonverbal communication is used. So you're in most situations, especially face-to-face, you are using nonverbal communication. So that can be your body language, how you're sitting, how you're standing, how you move your hands, how you position yourself towards or away from another person. That's all communication. You also have facial expressions, frowning, smiling. That all communicates something about how you're feeling, whether you're interested, whether you understand. And some other forms that might be useful for you could be Makaton, again, picture boards, communication passports, or just writing or typing. Now, picture boards or communication passports, if you haven't heard of them before, picture boards are usually, it is set out as a board with pictures, like it might have orange juice, it might have toast. It is a way for people to communicate their needs and what they want by pointing to the picture. Communication passports are fairly similar. They're usually printed up as a pocket-sized book that the person can have on them all of the time to help them communicate. All right, the next one. Explain the impact of using nonverbal communication methods to support individuals. Now it does say methods, so we need definitely more than one. I'd aim for 3 minimum. And it does say explain, so we would want to describe it a bit, give an example from work if you can. So how to do this? We want to think about how an individual might feel if you approach them while smiling versus frowning, let's say. So the impact of that is if you approach them while frowning and maybe you've got your hands on your hips, then they might feel a little bit intimidated and they might not want to communicate with you. Versus if you're smiling, they might feel more comfortable, more likely to communicate, more likely to tell you about their needs and their preferences and what they want to do that day, or if they have any trouble or problems. So that would potentially impact on that person's care and support and how well their needs and rights are being met. And let's think about maybe how an individual who uses Makaton might feel if no one in maybe their supported living service or the care home or nobody who's supporting them uses Makaton. That would be their entire, well, maybe not entire, it depends on the individual. If Makaton is that individual's main way of communicating and no one uses it with them, think about how you'd feel if you couldn't communicate. It would be very hard, it would be very frustrating. It would make your life very difficult to communicate your needs or to ask for help. So, if we use these non-verbal forms of communication like Makaton with people who use them, that will again impact on their care and support. It'll improve their care and support because it will ensure their rights as well, because everyone has a right to proper care and support. If you can't communicate, if you can't take part in, let's say, your care planning process or your choices throughout the day, then you will become very frustrated, most likely. Okay, see if you can think of any other examples as well that you could include. Next, we're on to define active listening. If you haven't heard of active listening before, it is when the listener fully concentrates, understands, and then responds to what is being said. Normally, we have a habit of, let's say, when we're in a conversation, of somebody tells you something that happened to them last week or yesterday or today, and you jump in with a similar story. Everyone has that habit, or nearly everyone has that habit, that they jump in with their story. Active listening is where you stick with the individual who's speaking, stick with their story, and you're responding to their story, not jumping in with your own. So you're fully focused on that person and what they are trying to talk to you about, not changing the subject. In normal conversation, that's fine. We're all used to jumping in with our own stories, but sometimes people need to stick with the topic that they've brought up. And that's where active listening comes in. Now, we need to explain how to use active listening in your role. You want to encourage the person to keep speaking. That could mean that you nod along. Normally when somebody is speaking, they look away and they look back a little bit, and they look away when they're thinking. When they're looking back, you want to nod along, make some encouraging noises like yes, and to encourage them to keep talking. Just so they know that you're interested. If people don't feel that you're interested in what they're saying, they're not going to keep talking. So that's one way. Giving the speaker time to think is another important point. You don't want to necessarily jump in with questions or suggestions or finishing the person's sentence without giving them time to speak or to think. If they are struggling with an idea and you think they're clearly struggling, you've given them a bit of time, then maybe jump in with your suggestions, but it shouldn't be straight away. Let people think and form their thoughts, because what you think is the logical conclusion of that sentence or idea might not necessarily be what they were going for, and it might change the flow of the conversation, or their flow of thought. So best to give them some time to think. Same with avoiding interrupting with your own stories. We don't want to do that necessarily. And making eye contact again shows that you're interested. Like I said earlier, the person who's speaking normally looks away and looks back, and looks away again when they're speaking and thinking. But it's more normal for the listener to make more eye contact and keep an eye on the speaker's face. And another point was to rephrase what's being said. It shows that you are interested, it shows you're listening, and it shows you've understood. It also gives you a chance to confirm that you've understood what's been said. Right. Next question. Explain the importance of active listening. In care roles, it is very important to be able to use active listening. We need to build rapport, we need to build trust, or else we might find that people don't tell us important things that we need to be able to support them. It also can build the confidence of the speaker if the speaker feels that they are valued and it feels that you are going to focus on what they're saying, that you're interested in what they're saying. Then it can help with their confidence, and it can help them to speak more and say more, and to ask for what they want or to raise problems when they come up. And the final point I've said there is that ensures you know what has actually been said, what the issue the person wanted to get across to you was, by not jumping in with your own stories, and to make sure that you've rephrased and reiterated what's been said to them to confirm that you have understood it properly. Okay. Next is to assess how your communication can affect others. So for this, we want to think about the communication methods you use. Are you probably using verbal communication methods? Are you using any other communication methods? Could picture boards or communication passports or Makaton be useful to you? If you are interested in learning Makaton, there are classes you can take, but there are also quite a few YouTube channels that might be useful to you to get started and learn a few things. Do you need to practice any areas of communication? Like I said before, most of us have a habit of jumping in with our own stories, so maybe active listening is an area that you might want to practice. And you'd also want to think about how others might feel when they're communicating with you. Do you think they're comfortable? Do you think you're meeting everyone's needs? Are there any changes that you would like to make? Next, we have describe different ways that individuals communicate. Now for this one, it is describe, so we need to give a few examples and a little bit about how it actually works. It wouldn't do just to list examples. So I have broken it into two categories, verbal methods and nonverbal methods. So let's take nonverbal methods first, actually. If we said something like, we could open with, there are many ways that people communicate, including nonverbal and verbal methods. Some nonverbal methods include writing, body language, facial expressions. If I was talking about writing, I might talk about people often write emails, letters, they might write memos, they might make posters. Posters could be used to get across short information or important information, using short sentences, slogans, or as well as visual pictures to catch the attention, whereas writing an email or a letter might be a lot more detailed. and yeah, might be a lot more detailed. We could stop there. If I was talking about verbal methods, I might talk about how people might communicate by speaking or singing. These methods are important because of the word choice, but also because of the volume, pitch, and tone of voice that brings across quite a lot of. It can change the meaning of the message depending on where the inflection is, where the emphasis in the sentence is. It can make it sarcastic or it can make it sincere. So, have a think about different methods. We've mentioned a few before. You could mention any of them, Makaton, British Sign Language, and describe them, or picture boards and how they're used. So pick a few of those. It does say different ways that individuals communicate. All right, next up we have describe how to establish an individual's communication and language needs and preferences. So again, I've made a little list, but you want to describe how you would do it. So some methods, and give a bit more detail than this, are to ask them. Verbally asking people how they prefer to communicate could be important. Let's say if it was an initial meeting for doing a care plan, making up a care plan, you might want to come back to them at some point about some details of it or to arrange a review. You might ask them whether they'd rather communicate by phone, by email, by text, or by letter. That's one method. So another method, say after the care plans are made up, would be, and you're maybe a new member of staff, you would check the care plans. Usually there's a specific heading, especially if somebody has specific communication needs for how they like to be communicated with. As well, you could ask family or friends, so long as it's not a confidentiality issue. And you could ask professionals as well. Again, so long as it's not a confidentiality issue, you could get advice from professionals. Say if somebody has had a recent stroke, then that would need to be added into the care plan, the speech, and if they have some damage or weakness to the muscles around their mouth or throat, then the speech and language therapist might give advice on how to support that individual to communicate. Right, next we have describe methods of communication used to meet an individual's communication needs, wishes, and preferences. For this one, you want to talk about methods of communication that you've used. So whether you're using verbal methods, if you use Makaton or picture boards, if it is anything else, if it's written methods, describe them. How do you use them? How are they meeting somebody's communication needs, wishes, and preferences? How do you know that they're meeting the individual's needs, wishes, and preferences? And make sure that you describe a few methods that you're using. Minimum 3 again. It does ask you to describe methods, not just a method. All right. Describe the term confidentiality. So if you're not already familiar, spelling. Don't mind me. So describe the term confidentiality. I feel like I need to change that, but I will do it later. So it means not sharing information with anyone who is not entitled to it. So everybody has a right to privacy. Anyone's personal information, which can be address, date of birth, any health conditions, bank details, anything like that, it's private information. It is up to them who they want to share it with. So we have to make sure that if we are sharing it, it is somebody that needs it, and that is someone who the individual has consented to it being shared with. So we have to ensure that the information is stored securely. This can be passwords for computers. Any paper information should be stored in locked cabinets, and we'll get into that a bit more in a minute, I think. Here we go, legislation first. So we need to identify, which again, just list. Identify legislation and agreed ways of working that relate to confidentiality. So, a couple of examples. There are quite a few more. You can have a look online if you want yourself. But we have the Data Protection Act, which is the one that says that we have that information must be stored confidentially, excuse me, and it lays out the regulations for storing and sharing information. It was updated in 2018 to be in line with the General Data Protection Regulations, or GDPR, which was brought in across the EU. You also have the Human Rights Act, which says that everyone has a right to private and family life. So privacy and confidentiality are covered there. And we have the Mental Capacity Act 2005 and the Mental Health Act 2003. Those acts cover some situations where information has to be shared in the best interests of the individual. So in general, all information must be kept private, but those two acts cover some situations where we might have to share information without consent. Okay, and then agreed ways of working that relate to confidentiality. We want to talk about how information is stored in your workplace, and which could be where would you hold sensitive discussions, what would you do if somebody called asking for information about a service user. So first off, how is information stored in your workplace? I started talking about that a minute ago. So it might be that any laptops, tablets, phones, computers are password protected, that you don't share your password with anyone, that there's a firewall and antivirus software to protect the information. And it might be that if you are downloading anything, any files that you have to, or opening any files that have been emailed to you, that you have to scan them with the antivirus software before you open them. Where would you hold any sensitive information? Sensitive discussions. So if you needed to have a discussion about somebody's care plan or somebody's health, you wouldn't have that discussion. Let's imagine it's a care home. You wouldn't have that discussion in the lounge where anyone could walk in. You might have that discussion in the individual's room, or a quiet room that you can close the door to, or an office, just to make sure that people aren't walking in, they're not walking past, and they wouldn't hear anything that should be confidential. And what would you do if someone called asking for information about a service user? Now, depending on your setting and your procedures or your agreed ways of working, it might be that you take that person's details and pass it on to the manager or a team leader. It might be that you take the person's details and their company, or if they've said they're from the police or from they're the social worker, that you would take their place of work and you would check that the phone number they give you is for that actual place of work, and then call back and ask to be transferred to them through reception. It might also be, ideally in these situations as well, you would ask the individual for permission to share the information. All right, so that's that. Identify legislation and agreed ways of working that relate to confidentiality. Let's look at the next one. Okay, so this will be very similar again. Describe ways of handling confidential information. Make sure You might have talked about some of them in the last question, but make sure you cover the storing, processing, and sharing of information. So storing we've already talked about. Processing is how that information is used while you have it. So if you took somebody's bank details to arrange payment for the service, then you would make sure that those bank details are stored securely and that they're only used for what has been agreed. Any other information that you take should really only be used for what has been agreed unless a safeguarding issue comes into play. Sharing of information, you'll want to talk about how information is shared. So sometimes some companies, the NHS for example, they have encrypted emails, and some information, mostly patient data, will only be shared through the encrypted email to another encrypted email. In other cases, when you're sending information by email, let's say, you might only use the individual's initials, so that protects the individual's identity. The same with some, if you're doing daily living records, depends on your setting, so check your own procedures on this, but some places, some settings and some companies say to just use the initials in the daily living records as well. So those are some examples. I would recommend that you check your company handbook or check your policies and procedures to see what different, if there are any differences in your setting. And that's everything. That is Standard 3, the importance of communication. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you very much.